The sympathy card in my hands read, Sarah Miller, 1985 to 2023. My husband's signature was still wet. The front door exploded inward as a man in black lunged at me, his knife glinting. I swung my graphic design portfolio like a battering ram. His ribs cracked, but the burner phone in my pocket buzzed with a text. Run. They know you're alive. The ledger in my bag proved Mark had already cashed in on my death. And the woman who sent that warning? She wasn't on my side. The P.O. box key burned in my palm. Inside was proof, my mail, my life, rerouted to hide the truth. Jim Henderson, the retired postal worker who handed it to me, whispered, Chloe Stevens paid me to find out why Mark's dead wife is still breathing. The knife-wielding investigator groaned behind me, reaching for his radio. I had 30 seconds before reinforcements arrived. The ledger was my only weapon. The morning light caught the dust motes dancing over the Formica tabletop. Sarah slid a thumbnail under the heavy cream envelope seal, the paper resisting with a crisp, fibrous snap. Inside, a card embossed with silver lilies smelled faintly of stale lavender and basement dampness. She expected a condolence note for her mother, a late arrival from a distant cousin, or perhaps a neighbor. Instead, a newsprint clipping fluttered onto her lap. The ink smeared against her thumb as she smoothed the paper. Her own face stared upward, the graduation portrait from 3 years ago, where her smile strained against the weight of Mark's gaze behind the camera. Above the image, bold black letters announced her passing. The text detailed a tragic, lingering illness, praising a devoted husband who remained by her side until the final breath. A floorboard groaned in the hallway. Sarah's lungs tightened, the air turning to grit in her throat. She traced the date on the obituary. According to the local gazette, she had been buried in the Oak Grove Cemetery 4 days ago. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She wasn't dead. She was sitting in her kitchen in Naperville, the smell of damp earth from the card filling her nostrils. But the paper in her hand said otherwise. It was a cold, calculated erasure. Mark hadn't just lied. He had published the lie, bound it in newsprint, and sent it to their home like a trophy. Footsteps thudded against the linoleum. Mark leaned in the doorway, the scent of pine-scented floor wax clinging to his flannel shirt. He gripped a steaming mug, his knuckles white against the ceramic. He didn't ask what she held. He simply watched the clipping tremble in her hand. His expression settled into the practiced mask of a grieving widower. The mail arrived early, he murmured, his voice dropping into a gentle, terrifying rasp. He crossed the kitchen, the shadow of his frame swallowing the table. He reached out, his fingers brushing the hair away from her temple with a tenderness that made her skin crawl. You should rest, Sarah. People expect a certain stillness from the departed. Sarah's hand dived into her pocket, her thumb finding the jagged edge of the broken ceramic shard she kept there. The sharp sting of the porcelain biting into her skin was the only thing that felt real. Mark's world was a stage, and he was the director. But this pain, this small, private bleeding, was hers alone. It proved she wasn't a ghost. I'm not dead, Mark, she whispered, her voice cracking like dry wood. The world thinks you are, he replied, his voice as smooth as polished stone. And in this world, the consensus is the only truth that matters. He turned away, the rhythmic click-snap of his silver stopwatch echoing in the quiet kitchen. He was timing her. He was waiting for her to break, to fade away into the silence he had built for her. But Sarah felt a cold fire igniting in her chest. She wasn't going to be buried while she still had breath in her lungs. The silence of the house was interrupted by a violent crash. The front door didn't just open, it splintered. The sound of wood groaning and metal yielding tore through the artificial peace of the Naperville morning. Sarah didn't have time to process the fear before a man she had never seen, thick-set, wearing a nondescript canvas jacket, charged into the kitchen. He didn't look like a thief. He looked like a technician, someone sent to remove a piece of faulty equipment. Sarah lunged for the counter. Her fingers closed around the handle of her heavy graphic design portfolio, the metal-edged leather case she used for her high-end client presentations. It weighed 10 pounds, filled with thick cardstock and metal binders. As the intruder reached for her, his breath smelling of stale coffee and peppermint, Sarah swung with every ounce of terror-fueled adrenaline in her body. The metal edge of the portfolio caught the man squarely across the ribs. A sickening crack echoed in the small space, the sound of a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. The intruder gasped, his face contorting into a mask of shock as the air was punched out of him. He stumbled back, his hand clawing at the air, but Sarah didn't wait to see if he'd recover. She swung again, this time aiming for his head. The corner of the portfolio clipped his brow, and blood, hot, bright and metallic smelling, sprayed across her white linoleum floor. The man fell against the kitchen island, his fingers dragging through a bowl of fruit, sending apples rolling across the tile like heavy marbles. Sarah bolted. She didn't look for Mark. She knew Mark wouldn't be there to help. He was the one who had invited the wolf into the house. She sprinted through the mudroom, the smell of laundry detergent and wet shoes filling her nose, and burst through the back door into the damp suburban morning. The grass was slick with dew, soaking through her socks as she ran toward the tree line of the nearby park, her breath coming in ragged, freezing gulps. The park was a blur of gray mist and skeletal oak trees. Sarah crouched behind a thick trunk, her chest heaving, her hands shaking so violently she had to shove them into her pockets. Her thumb found the ceramic shard, pressing until the sharp edge drew a fresh bead of blood. I am here. I am alive. I am Sarah Miller. You shouldn't be out here, a voice whispered from the shadows. Sarah jumped, her back slamming against the rough bark. A man stood a few yards away, partially obscured by the fog. He was older, with a slight stoop in his shoulders and a permanent ink stain on his right middle finger. He patted his shirt pocket nervously, checking for reading glasses that weren't there. "Who are you?" Sarah hissed, her eyes darting toward the street where she expected to see Mark's car at any moment. "Jim," the man said, his voice a low mumble. "Jim Henderson. I worked the route, your route, for 20 years. Now we stay quiet. Now we listen." He was narrating his own movements, a strange, rhythmic habit that made him seem both eccentric and oddly grounded. Jim stepped closer, the smell of old paper and peppermint tea clinging to his wool coat. "I saw the mail, Sarah. Or rather, I saw the lack of it. A house like yours. It generates paper. Bills, catalogs, letters. But for months, nothing. Then I saw where it was going. Mark was moving it, all of it. To a box downtown, box 412. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, her suspicion a cold weight in her stomach. "Because my father died in a cage because of a piece of paper he couldn't find." Jim whispered, his eyes moist. "I know what it looks like when someone is being erased. He's making you a ghost on paper so he can make you a ghost in the world." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass key. He held it out, his hand trembling. "Go to the facility on 4th Street, box 412. The truth is heavy, Sarah. It's bound in leather and filled with numbers that don't add up." Sarah took the key, the cold metal biting into her palm. She didn't know if she could trust this man, but she knew she couldn't stay in the park. The silence of Naperville was closing in, and she needed a weapon more powerful than a portfolio. She needed the paper that proved she existed. Subverted Beat 1.4. Phase 1. Smart Decision. Sarah decided that the only way to fight a paper ghost was with paper facts. Jim's information about the P.O. box was the first real lead she'd had since the world turned upside down. It was a logical, tactical move. If Mark was redirecting her life to a small metal box, then that box held the keys to his undoing. She knew how these facilities worked. Low security, mostly automated and invisible to the casual observer. She would slip in, take the ledger Jim described, and have the physical evidence of insurance fraud she needed to go to the federal authorities. This wasn't just a guess. It was a professional calculation. As a designer, she knew that every system had a back door, and Box 412 was Mark's. Phase 2. False Positive. The facility was a sterile corridor of white tile and fluorescent hum. Sarah's heart raced, but her hands were steady as she slid the brass key into the lock of Box 412. It turned with a satisfying, oily click. Inside lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. She pulled it out, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers, the forged signatures, the payouts from 3 different life insurance companies totaling millions. It was all there. The death of Sarah Miller was a lucrative business. She felt a surge of pure, crystalline relief wash over her. She had it. She had the proof. She tucked the ledger under her arm and turned to find Jim waiting by the exit, a small, encouraging smile on his face. "You did it," he whispered. "You have the truth." She felt, for the first time in days, like she could breathe. The nightmare was ending. Phase 3. The crack, but as they walked toward the glass doors, Sarah noticed something off. Jim wasn't looking at the exit. He was looking at his watch, the same rhythmic, obsessive way Mark did. And he wasn't mumbling his usual self-narrations. He was silent, his posture suddenly straight, the stoop in his shoulders gone. He reached out and touched the glass of the door, but he didn't push it open. Instead, he leaned back against the frame, his eyes turning cold and sharp, losing the watery kindness that had drawn her in. A cold prickle of unease danced across the back of Sarah's neck. The air in the sterile hallway suddenly felt thin, the smell of industrial bleach turning sharp and caustic. Phase 4. Catastrophic Reveal. "You really are as good as they said," Jim murmured, his voice no longer a shaky whisper, but a resonant, professional baritone. Sarah stepped back, clutching the ledger to her chest. "What are you talking about?" "The ledger, Sarah. It's not just proof of fraud. It's the only copy of the offshore routing codes." Jim stepped toward her, and the door behind him clicked shut, locked from the outside. "I don't care about your death. Neither does my employer. Chloe Stevens has been waiting a long time to get her hands on Mark's private accounts, and you just delivered the keys right to us." The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow to the stomach. Jim wasn't a sympathetic bystander. He was a scout. He hadn't been helping her find her life. He had been using her as a bloodhound to find the one thing Mark had hidden too well for Chloe to find. Chloe. Sarah gasped, her knees feeling weak. "The woman from the firm?" "Mark's former partner," Jim said, reaching into his coat, not for glasses, but for a compact black radio. The one he squeezed out of the $10 million merger. "She doesn't want you saved, Sarah. She wants Mark ruined, and she needs that book to do it. Once she has the money, you're just a loose end in a story that's already been written." The facility's lights flickered, and Sarah realized with a jolt of horror that she was in a worse position than before. She hadn't found an ally. She had handed the only leverage she had over her husband to a woman who hated him even more than she did. She was trapped in a locked hallway with a man who had spent days perfecting a lie just to get her to open a door. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a pawn in a war between two monsters, and the ledger in her hand felt like a lead weight pulling her under. Sarah backed away, her heels clicking on the tile, the sound echoing like a countdown. She had no ID, no money, and now the person she thought was her savior was calling in her location to a woman who viewed her as a disposable tool. The neon sign of the Sleep Easy motel flickered, casting a rhythmic, sickly green light across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Sarah stood at the front desk, her fingers trembling as she pulled a plastic card from her wallet. It was an emergency card, one she'd kept hidden in the lining of her purse for years, a just-in-case for a rainy day. Well, it wasn't just raining. The levee had broken. The clerk, a man with skin the color of old parchment and eyes that didn't seem to blink, took the card without a word. He swiped it through the reader. The machine let out a sharp, discordant beep, a digital rejection that felt like a slap. Declined. The clerk grunted, his voice like gravel. Try it again, Sarah urged, her voice tight. There must be a mistake. It's a high-limit card. He swiped it again. Beep. He tried a second card. Beep, then a third. Every time, the red light on the machine flashed like a warning. Listen, lady, the clerk said, leaning forward. The smell of stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener wafted over the counter. I just ran your ID through the system to verify the name. It's flagged. Social Security Administration. This number belongs to a deceased individual. Sarah Miller died 4 days ago. Sarah felt the world tilt. It wasn't just that she couldn't pay. She didn't exist. Mark hadn't just faked an obituary. He had reached into the digital guts of the country and pulled the plug on her identity. She was a living person with a dead person's shadow. I'm right here, she whispered, gesturing to herself. I'm standing in front of you. Not according to the screen. You ain't, the clerk replied, sliding her ID back across the counter. I can't rent to a ghost. It's bad for the insurance. Get out before I call the cops to haul away whatever's left of you. Sarah grabbed her cards and bolted. She felt a frantic, clawing need for help, a primal urge to find someone in a uniform who could fix this. She saw a patrol car idling at a red light 2 blocks away, its blue and red lights casting long shadows against the brick buildings. Subverted Beat 2.2, Phase 1. Smart decision. Sarah knew that in a civilized world, the police were the ultimate arbiters of truth. If her identity had been stolen, if her legal existence had been erased, then a police report was the first step toward resurrection. It was the logical, responsible thing to do. She wasn't a criminal. She was a victim of a massive, sophisticated fraud. She would approach the officer, explain the situation with the obituary and the bank accounts, and demand an investigation. She had the physical evidence, the cards, the clipping, the ledger she'd managed to keep hidden in her coat. The law would have to protect her. It was their job. Phase 2. False positive. She ran toward the car, waving her arms. The window rolled down, and a blast of warm air and the scent of old leather hit her. The officer inside looked up, his expression neutral. Officer, please, Sarah gasped, leaning against the door. I need to report a crime. My husband. He's faked my death. My accounts are frozen. My ID is flagged. I'm Sarah Miller. I'm not dead. The officer looked at her, his eyes softening. Slow down, ma'am. Sarah Miller, from over on Oak Street? Sarah nodded vigorously, tears of relief pricking her eyes. Yes, yes, that's me. I know Mark, the officer said, a small smile playing on his lips. Good man. He's been a wreck since the funeral. Come on, hop in the back. We'll get this sorted out. You look like you've had a rough night. Sarah felt the tension drain from her body. Finally, someone who knew them. Someone who could see the truth. She opened the back door and slid onto the hard plastic seat. The click of the door closing sounding like the first note of a song of safety. Phase 3. The crack, but as the officer pulled away from the curb, he didn't turn toward the station. He turned toward the highway, heading back toward the suburbs. Sarah frowned, looking at the back of his head. He was humming a low, tuneless melody. She looked at his name tag, Officer Miller. Not a relative, but the name was a coincidence that suddenly felt heavy. He reached for his radio, but he didn't call in a report. He pressed a button on his dash, and Sarah heard the distinct click of the child safety locks engaging. Officer? The station is the other way, she said, her voice rising. The officer didn't look back. Mark told me you might get confused, Sarah. Said the episode was getting worse. He's really worried about your stability. Trespassing at a motel, claiming to be a ghost. It's a textbook breakdown. Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. The realization hit her like a bucket of ice water. He wasn't taking her to the station to help her. He was taking her back to Mark. You're friends with him, she whispered, her heart hammering against the plastic seat. We go way back, Officer Miller said, his voice losing its warmth. Mark's a pillar of this community. You? You're a tragedy, Sarah. A woman who couldn't handle the pressure and snapped. If I take you in, you'll just end up in a psych ward under a John Doe hold. But if I take you home, Mark can get you the private care you need. He's trying to kill me, Sarah screamed, slamming her fists against the reinforced glass. He's trying to protect his family, the officer countered. And I'm helping him. You're not a victim, Sarah. You're a liability, and liabilities get liquidated. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. Mark, I've got her. Yeah, she tried the I'm alive routine at a motel. I'm bringing her to the secondary location. Have the doctor ready. Sarah realized with a gut-wrenching horror that by seeking the law, she had delivered herself directly into the hands of the man who had erased her. The police weren't her shield. They were Mark's cleanup crew. She was trapped in a cage of the state's making, being driven toward a recovery that would end in her permanent silence. She had to get out, or the obituary she'd found this morning would become the only thing left of her. The Rusty Spoon Diner was a tomb of grease and bad lighting. Sarah sat in the back booth, her face hidden behind a tattered menu, the smell of burnt coffee and old frying oil thick in the air. She had escaped the police car by kicking out the side window during a sudden stop, a desperate, lunging move that had left her shins bruised and her spirit shattered. Now, she was a fugitive, hiding in a place that felt like it was rotting from the inside out. She pushed open the door to the restroom, needing to splash cold water on her face to see if she still recognized the woman in the mirror. The room was small, smelling of industrial lemon and something metallic. As she reached for the faucet, the door behind her clicked shut. A man was standing there. He was thin, with skin like parchment and a buzz cut that looked like it had been done with a ruler. He smelled of artificial lemon, the same scent that was currently stinging her nostrils. He didn't say a word. He just pulled a pair of latex gloves onto his hands, the snap of the rubber sounding like a gunshot in the small space. This was the cleaner, Mark's shadow. He lunged. His movements were clinical, efficient. He didn't swing wild. He went for her throat, his fingers like steel cables. Sarah dodged, her back slamming against the tiled wall. She reached out, her hand finding a bottle of heavy-duty bleach-based cleaner under the sink. She didn't think. She twisted the nozzle and sprayed. The liquid hit the man squarely in the eyes. He let out a strangled, gurgling cry, his hands flying to his face. The smell of chlorine and burning skin filled the room. Sarah didn't wait. She grabbed the heavy porcelain lid of the toilet tank, a massive, frigid slab of stone, and swung it with both hands. It connected with the side of the man's head with a dull, wet thud. He crumpled to the floor, his body twitching once before going still. Sarah stood over him, the lid still in her hands, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked down at the man who had been sent to finish her, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like a predator. She fled the diner, the cool night air hitting her face like a benediction. She needed a new plan. She needed someone who wasn't Mark, wasn't Jim, and wasn't the law. She found Chloe Stevens in a secluded park on the edge of the city. Chloe was younger than Sarah expected, with wide, doll-like eyes and a habit of twisting a strand of blonde hair around her finger. She looked like she was made of glass, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. "You found the ledger," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "Jim told me. I didn't think you'd actually do it." "Jim works for you," Sarah said, her voice hard. "He tried to trap me. He was supposed to protect the evidence," Chloe cried. Right? Verbal tics starting to flare up. "Mark is a monster, He ruined my father, right? He took everything. I thought if I could get that book, I could stop him. I didn't mean for you to get hurt, Sarah watched her, seeing the genuine terror in the girl's eyes. Chloe wasn't a mastermind. She was another victim, someone Mark had used and discarded. "He's taking the children," Sarah said, the words tasting like ash. "He's taking them to London." Chloe nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "He told them you were sick, in a hospital. He told them you didn't want to see them because your brain was broken. He's been teaching them to be afraid of you, Sarah. He's erasing their memory of your voice, Right?" Sarah felt a cold, sharp pain in her chest. Worse than the ceramic shard, worse than the police car. Her children, her babies. Mark was turning them into orphans, while their mother was still standing right in front of them. "I have money," Chloe whispered, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a thick envelope and a burner phone. "It's my runaway fund. I was going to use it to disappear, but you need it more. The Family Founders Gala is in 6 hours. He's going to announce the move there. It's your last chance, right? Sarah took the envelope. The weight of the cash was the first bit of solid ground she'd felt in days. "Why are you helping me now?" Chloe looked at her, and for a moment, the doll-like mask slipped, revealing a deep, hollowed-out grief. "Because if he wins, then the lie is the only thing left. And I can't live in a world where he's the hero of the story. You have to be the one to kill the ghost, Sarah. Because I'm too afraid to even try." The 24-hour business center was a cavern of humming machines and blue light. Sarah sat at a high-end workstation, her fingers flying across the keyboard. As a graphic designer, she knew how to manipulate perception. She knew that a well-placed font and the right weight of cardstock could open doors that were supposed to be locked. She spent 3 hours crafting a VIP press pass. She matched the holographic seal of the Family Founders Gala using a specialized foil printer she'd found in the back of the shop. She adjusted the kerning on the international press header until it looked indistinguishable from the real thing. She was building herself a new identity, one page at a time. When she stepped out of the shop, the sun was beginning to set over Chicago, casting long, bloody shadows across the skyscrapers. She was wearing a sleek, black suit she'd bought with Chloe's money, her hair pulled back in a tight, professional knot. She looked like a journalist. She looked like someone who belonged. The luxury hotel was a fortress of mahogany and velvet. Private security guards with earpieces and cold eyes patrolled the perimeter. Sarah joined a group of international journalists, mimicking their hurried, self-important stride. She held up her pass, the holographic seal catching the light. The guard barely glanced at it. He nodded, stepping aside to let her pass. The ballroom was a sea of glittering dresses and expensive cologne. At the far end, on a stage draped in white silk, Mark was standing at a podium. He looked perfect. The grieving widower, the philanthropist, the man of the year. My late wife, Sarah, believed in the power of community. Mark's voice boomed through the speakers, smooth and practiced. And it is in her memory that I am donating her entire estate to the Miller Foundation for mental health. Sarah felt a surge of nausea. He was selling her life to fund his own lies. She began to move through the crowd, her eyes scanning for a way to get closer to the stage. But then, she saw him, Robert Kelly, Mark's head of security. He was standing near the service entrance, his hand tapping rhythmically against his holster. He saw her. His eyes widened, and he began to move toward her, pushing through the crowd like a shark through water. Sarah turned and bolted toward the service elevators. She ducked inside just as the doors were closing, but a heavy hand caught the edge of the metal. Kelly forced his way in, the smell of gun oil and peppermint gum filling the small space. He didn't wait for the doors to shut. He lunged. It was a raw, physical struggle. Kelly was twice her size, his muscles like iron. He slammed her against the wall, his forearm pressing against her throat. Sarah clawed at his face, her thumb finding the ceramic shard in her pocket. She didn't use it on him. She used it to slice through the strap of her heavy bag, swinging the weight of the leather and the ledger into his groin. Kelly doubled over, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. Sarah grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall of the elevator and swung it with both hands. The metal cylinder connected with the back of his head with a ringing clang. He fell, unconscious, before he hit the floor. Sarah hit the emergency stop, trapping the elevator between floors. She stripped off her jacket, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She had to get to the stage. She had to stop the speech. She climbed out of the elevator's service hatch into the darkened corridor behind the stage. She could hear Mark's voice, closer now, dripping with false emotion. Sarah was a light that went out too soon, he said. But her legacy will live on. Sarah stepped toward the curtain, but a shadow blocked her path. Mark was standing there, his face illuminated by the dim backstage lights. He wasn't on stage anymore. The speech was a recording, a pre-taped tribute playing for the crowd while he handled the problem backstage. He held a silver syringe in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. "The final act, Sarah," he whispered, his voice a terrifying rasp. "A suicide note, written in your hand, or a very good imitation of it, and a lethal dose of sedative. The grieving widower finds his wife's body in a hotel room, unable to cope with her breakdown. It's poetic, don't you think?" "The world knows I'm here, Mark," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "No, Sarah. The world knows a ghost is here, and ghosts don't leave footprints." He lunged, the needle glinting in the light. Sarah ducked, her hand diving into her pocket. She didn't pull out the shard. She pulled out the burner phone Chloe had given her, the one that had been recording the entire conversation. "I'm not a ghost, Mark," she whispered. "I'm the witness." Before he could react, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the corridor. Local police, led by Officer Miller, burst through the doors. "There she is," Mark cried, his face instantly shifting into a mask of distress. "That's the woman who's been harassing me. She's dangerous." Officer Miller stepped forward, his hand on his holster. "Sarah Miller, you're under arrest for trespassing and harassment." Sarah watched in horror as the handcuffs were snapped onto her wrists. Mark leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. "The children are already in the limo, Sarah. By the time you get out of holding, we'll be over the Atlantic. Goodbye, Ghost." He turned and walked away, his stride confident and smooth. Sarah was led away, her heart breaking as she saw a strange woman, the nanny, leading Emily and Jacob toward the exit. Emily was whispering something. "I'm sorry, Floor. I'm sorry, Dor." Sarah was alone. She was in handcuffs. And the man who had killed her was about to get away with it. The hotel security office was a small, windowless room filled with monitors. Sarah sat in a hard plastic chair, her hands cuffed behind her back, watching the gala on a screen. Mark was back on stage, receiving a standing ovation. He looked like a king. But Mark had forgotten one thing. He had forgotten that Sarah was a designer. She didn't just know how to draw, she knew how to build systems. And she still had the tablet she'd smuggled in, hidden in the waistband of her trousers. She waited until the guard turned his back to answer a phone call. With a dexterity born of years of fine motor work, she maneuvered the tablet out. She didn't need her hands free, she just needed her thumb. She tapped into the hotel's integrated media server, a system she'd studied while forging the press pass. She uploaded the audio file from the burner phone, the recording of the cleaner confessing to the insurance fraud, and Mark's own voice threatening her backstage. Then, she used her design software to create a side-by-side comparison of the forged obituary and the real government documents she'd scanned from the ledger. She hit broadcast. In the ballroom, the tribute video suddenly cut to black. Then, a voice filled the room, a wet, gurgling voice. "Mark Miller paid me to make her disappear. He's been collecting the payouts for months." Masterisk. Then, the images appeared. The forged signatures, the life insurance policies, and finally, the live audio of Mark backstage. The grieving widower finds his wife's body. It's poetic, don't you think? The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was a silence that felt like a physical weight. Sarah stood up, her handcuffs clinking. The guard turned, his face pale as he watched the screen. "I'm not a ghost," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the small room. "And I'm not finished." She used a small metal shim from her earrings, a trick she'd learned from a fellow ghost in the park, to pop the lock on the zip ties the police had used. She walked out of the security office, her head held high. She entered the ballroom just as the police were surrounding the stage. Mark was standing there, his face white, his widower persona crumbling like wet sand. He looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes weren't cold. They were terrified. "I'm alive, Mark," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "And you're the one who's about to disappear." The police shifted their focus. They weren't arresting a harasser anymore. They were arresting a murderer who hadn't quite finished the job. Seattle was a city of gray mist and the mournful groan of foghorns. Sarah sat on a park bench, watching Emily and Jacob play in the grass. They were laughing. A real, honest sound that she hadn't heard in years. It had been months since the gala. Mark was in federal prison, his charity revealed to be a money laundering front for a dozen different crimes. Chloe had disappeared with her runaway fund, a ghost of a different kind. Sarah pulled a heavy, expensive fountain pen from her bag, the one Mark had given her for their anniversary, while he was still faking her death. She looked at the final divorce and restitution papers in her lap. She signed her name, Sarah Miller. The ink was dark, permanent, and real. She wasn't a narrative device anymore. She wasn't a victim. She was a woman who had built a life out of the ashes of a lie. She left the pen on the bench and walked away, her children running to meet her. The fog was thick, but for the first time in her life, Sarah Miller knew exactly where she was going. She was going home. And this time, the world knew she was coming.